Good morning, church. I want to take this opportunity to say Happy Mother's Day to all the amazing moms out there. Thank you so much for raising your crazy kids and being amazing examples for your families. I hope today is a really special day for you. Right now, I want to take this moment to say Happy Mother's Day to my mom. Her name is Lisa, and she's watching from back home in Albuquerque. So, Happy Mother's Day, Mama. And, to all the moms out there, but specifically mine, I want to share this quote from the song by Tupac called Dear Mama. And the quote is like this, and I'm kind of going to sing it because I feel like it translates best. But he says, "And even though I act crazy, I got to thank the Lord that you made me." And I could sing the whole song for you, but I will spare you that. Happy Mother's Day, moms. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the lesson for today. So do me a favor and turn in your Bibles to John chapter 6. We're going to continue in our series on John today. Last week, Mike actually covered the first 15 verses of John chapter 6, in which Jesus actually performs a miracle by feeding 5,000 people, probably more than 5,000 people, not counting women and children, with 2 small fish and 5 barley loaves. And so up until this point, the narrative in the Gospel of John shows us that the disciples at the time and all the people that surrounded Jesus had the opportunity to witness Jesus perform many miracles. He had been healing people. He had already turned the water into wine. He'd done a few things, and then here he had just finished up feeding 5,000 people. And the indication that we get so far during this kind of gospel is that the disciples and those around Jesus don't really understand why Jesus is performing the miracles that he is. And they're amazed at his power, but they're kind of not getting the point. And one thing that Mike taught us last week from the Word is that Jesus' power, though amazing, isn't the point of John chapter 6. Jesus himself is the point. And I actually want to share a direct quote from the sermon last week where Mike said this, and quote, "The disciples needed a changed perspective that having Jesus, the bread of life, is all that matters. Jesus himself is the only one that satisfies." Close quote. Wherever you are, if you're laying in your bed or on your couch at home, I want to ask you to repeat after me if you feel comfortable doing it. Ready? Jesus is the point. Jesus is the treasure. Actually, I couldn't hear you, so you're going to have to do that again with me. Ready? Jesus is the point. Jesus is the treasure. Now you might ask, Daniel, why are you having us repeat that? It's like the most obvious thing ever. Well, because of the kind of people that we are naturally, we tend to forget things that we know, but for whatever reason, it slips our mind. But I can promise you this, that if we can root ourselves in this truth that Jesus is the point and Jesus is the treasure, then our lives will reflect the glory of God, and the amount of contentment that we experience will absolutely increase. Let's read the text for today, beginning in chapter 6, verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into the boat and set across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they'd rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now don't get me wrong, like Jesus walking on water, that's crazy. And I don't know if you've ever tried walking on water, but I'd assume it's pretty difficult. Can you imagine if you were just out at Horsetooth or your local reservoir or lake, and you were on a paddleboard. You know, the ones where you stand up, looks kind of like a surfboard, and you just have a real long paddle. You're out on your paddleboard, just minding your own business, and all of a sudden, you see your best friend, or maybe even just a stranger, walking on the water towards you. I would lose my mind. And then after I finished processing it, I'd probably come and record a video and then try to show all of you guys, or not show you, but tell you that I saw someone walking on the water, and no one would believe me. But what strikes me as interesting about this story is that it doesn't seem to fit where it's placed in the Gospel of John. Because right after these 6 verses, Jesus goes on to teach in depth that he is the bread of life. So it seems like there'd be a natural progression from Jesus feeding the 5,000 by multiplying these loaves of bread and these small fish, and then into his teaching that he is the bread of life. It seems like they would really progress right into each other. So here's my question. Is Jesus walking on water just kind of a side note in the midst of all this? It's kind of just another amazing thing that he does? Or is it actually connected with the rest of the chapter? Is there a reason why this is sandwiched in between Jesus describing himself as the bread of life? Well, I want to point out a significant trait that both situations have in common. Now, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, the people there were encountering a great need. And when Jesus meets his disciples on the lake, his disciples at that time were actually encountering a great need as well. In both situations, there is a great need that needs to be met. The crowds were in need of food because they were really hungry, and they were not near any source where they could be fed. And the 12 were stuck in the middle of a windy, wavy mess, and they needed rescuing. They needed protection. And in both situations, Jesus meets their material need. I have something that I want to share, and I actually heard a different preacher say this in a sermon during my time of preparation, and I want to encourage you with it as well because I think it's helpful. I want you to know that Jesus cares about the needs that you have in your life. He cares about people who are in need or are starving or don't have the money it takes to feed their families. He cares about those who are brokenhearted for any reason. He cares about the sick and the poor. He cares about COVID-19. He cares about your individual well-being. But more than all of that, he cares 10 million times more about the condition of your soul. He cares 10 million times more about your heart and about your eternity. So, are these two situations connected? Well, according to Mark's account, they're very connected. If we look at what he writes, starting in the second half of verse 50, it says, "Immediately he spoke to them and said, 'Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid.' Then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down." And then here's the important part. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So they didn't understand why Jesus performed the miracle of feeding people. I guess they just thought, well, they're hungry, so they should get food, and Jesus has got superpowers, so he let it happen. But obviously that's not what Jesus was trying to communicate with that miracle. So something clicked for the disciples when that happened. And if we look at Matthew's account, he records something special that helps us to grasp their realization. Starting in chapter 14, verses 32 through 33, it says, "And they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" They realized that who Jesus is matters far more than what Jesus can give or what he can do. Now, am I mad that Jesus can perform miracles? Or am I downplaying the fact that he can raise the dead and give sight to the blind? Absolutely not. But the fact that Jesus is the Son of God is transformative, and it's the most important thing that is revealed in this situation. So they realized who Jesus is matters more than what he can do. And so for the rest of our time together, I want to share 2 points. The first one is that Jesus meets us in the mess. And the second point is that Jesus is always in our boat. So let's get it going. So here's what we know. We know that after Jesus finished with that miracle, he kind of sent his 12 disciples on the way to cross the lake to go to Capernaum. And it was the end of the day. And we know that he had kind of ordered them to leave, so they get in the boat and they leave, and Jesus is dismissing the crowds. And it being the end of the day, the sun was going down. And, with there being 12 disciples, I'd imagine that there was a personality or two on board one of the ships. Or, there's probably only one ship. But anyway, I'd imagine someone like Thomas saying something like, it's going to be dark here in about 30, 45 minutes. It's not really safe to sail in the dark. I don't really like where this is going, But anyhow, it's just, that's their first obstacle. But then when they're several miles from shore, the waves start, or the wind starts to howl, and then the waves start to come, and it starts to buffet their boat. So now things go from are not ideal, they're crossing the lake in the dark, to awful because the wind starts and the waves start to overtake the boat. Now I tried to put myself in this situation, and I consider myself to be a decently level-headed person. I think I got that trait from my dad. And on top of that, I'm kind of a risk taker. I'm a daredevil of sorts. So the idea of crossing a lake in the dark actually sounds kind of fun to me. And even if waves got going, I might not be that afraid, but I was trying to think about this situation. I think where the fear would set in for me is that I'm rowing and rowing and rowing, and I'm not getting anywhere. And the waves are getting bigger and the wind is getting worse. And I'd imagine that's about the time where fear would set in, and I'd say, man, we might be in trouble if this gets any worse. What's interesting is that all 3 accounts highlight, Matthew, Mark, and John, they all highlight that the disciples became afraid. John's account says that they were frightened, and then Matthew and Mark's account say that they were terrified. But they're not afraid or terrified when they leave and it gets dark. They're not afraid or terrified when the wind starts and the waves start. Their fear begins to set in when they see a supernatural being walking towards them on the water. And it actually records that they confused Jesus for a ghost. The creator and sustainer of all things is approaching in their time of need, and their first reaction is to mistake him for an evil spirit of sorts. And I'm not actually faulting them for that, because given the conditions, I don't think they had a spotlight on their ship at the time. But in reality, they were so far off, they couldn't be further from the truth. Now, if I'm being honest, I really relate to these guys. I find myself in difficult situations often, and then I find that I'm so wound up in trying to find a solution that I neglect the help that's right in front of me. I refuse to take it to God in prayer, or I refuse to seek sound advice, and my pride can be so potent that even when I am in dire need, I can't see that I'm in dire need. I want to share briefly about a time about 5 years back when I lived in Albuquerque, and I'd been a Christian for a little bit over 2 years at the time, and I was 22, and there was a brother named Armin who baptized me, and he was kind of mentoring me at the time, and I'd communicated with Armin that I wanted to learn how to help people study the Bible. I wanted to be his right-hand man. I wanted to help him in any way that I could. And that sounds great, but I don't know how you would respond, but basically Armin would try to help me, grow in those areas, but I would kind of dismiss the advice that he would give me. And, for someone who was trying to learn how to grow in leadership, my pride was getting in the way, and I was hurting people in the different friendships and relationships that I was in at the time. And really, I wasn't being respectful or humble towards Armin, who was really trying to help me out. And I'd imagine he was kind of at his wit's end, and so he asked Josh, the man who leads the church in Albuquerque, to have a meeting with me to see if he could help out, because I was giving him a really hard time. And so, anyway, I have no idea what that conversation went like. I just know I got a call from Josh, and he asked if we can meet at Starbucks at 6 a.m. And I'll spare you most of the details, but basically, Josh told me that I was so prideful that I needed to just appreciate and obey the advice that was given to me by older men in my spiritual life. And he said it pretty bluntly, and I'm not going to lie to you. If he would have said it gently, I probably wouldn't have heard it, but he said it boldly, and at the time I was angry. And my first reaction was to think about how I'm about to go obey all this advice, and when it fails, I'm going to throw it back in his face. Because after all, I was 22, and I knew everything at the time. Because what 22-year-old doesn't know everything, right? So anyway, I leave this meeting with Josh, and I was frustrated, and I left resolved that I was going to obey out of spite and not with a good heart. And I ended up following his orders, and guess what happened? My life got better. The mistakes I had been making began to dissolve. I began to grow in the things Armin had been trying to help me grow in all along. And it's because I got some good life-saving advice. The advice to take input and be humble to others in my life changed everything. And if it wasn't for that meeting, I'm not sure where I would be right now. And to be honest, what I experienced was very much like what is described in James chapter 5 at the very end of the book. Starting in verse 19, it reads, "My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth, and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins." I look at times like these in my life, and I praise God for the people who helped me to see my need when I couldn't see it for myself. Now, I don't know if this resonates with you at all, but don't be like me. Don't be someone who refuses advice and who thinks they got everything figured out, because ultimately you might be neglecting a very, very serious need that is arisen in your life. But for you, maybe it's not the same kind of pride. Maybe it's a different kind of pride. So when trouble comes your way, let me ask you this. Do you ever find yourself worrying about a trouble that you're having, but finding out that the worry actually exceeds the trouble itself? Does that make sense? Like, you have a trouble, but then you have a worry, and that worry begins to multiply, and it becomes way more, and the worry itself actually causes you more trouble than the actual thing that you're fearing. That's called fear and insecurity, and believe it or not, fear and insecurity is still a form of pride. And you might think that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but think about it this way. When you have fear and insecurity to that extent, you're basically saying to God, without words, that the situation and trouble or challenge that you're facing is bigger than God is. You're basically communicating, well, God, I believe in you. I know that you made me. I know that you have my best interest in mind. I know that, the beautiful Rocky Mountains you created, and you hold everything together in the palm of your hands, but this particular financial situation, it's beyond you. And again, we would never say, hey, God, look, this problem's beyond you. But when we worry to that extent, and when we allow it to dwell and stir in our hearts, we're basically communicating to God that it's bigger than He is. And the truth is that our imagination can be extremely destructive when we allow it to go rogue. You see, on both ends of the spectrum, whether it's anxiety and fear and insecurity, or this gripping on this kind of superiority, this idea that we have it all figured out. Both of these spectrums highlight the truth about weakness. How do you deal with your weaknesses? Well, let's take a look at a great example of someone who deals with their weaknesses, or of how Paul deals with his weaknesses in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 7. Or because of these surpassingly great revelations, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he had said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You know, this setting is like Paul writing to this church in Corinth, and he's talking about how God has revealed some amazing things to him. There's some spiritual mysteries that are kind of layered in here, but the most important thing is that, or the most important thing to take note of is that when Paul experienced his weaknesses, and the categories he lists off here are his insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties, did he see the trouble? No. Paul saw opportunity. Think about this. Paul was so humble that he was even willing to view whatever the challenge was as something that's coming from God that would keep him from being conceited, that it would keep him from being prideful. And I understand that to someone who's in the midst of a challenging situation or maybe is hurting, that to think that God is bringing on this challenge or that he could even be a part of it, it's a hard thing to do. I mean, maybe you're dealing with a loss or an illness, and maybe you're heartbroken for a particular reason, or maybe your finances are in shambles, or the list could go on. I mean, honestly, there's innumerable amounts of trials that we'll face. But Paul was able to look beyond the pain and fix his eyes on Jesus and what awaits him in eternity, what awaits him in heaven. He trained his mind to know and accept that when he was weak, he is strong. Because why? Because of the power and the presence of Christ. How many opportunities are we missing out on right now because we refuse to acknowledge that we're in need? When you're facing trouble or you're in the middle of a struggle, what do you see? Where does your eyes go to? I'm here this morning to plead with you. Please, look for Jesus. He will meet you in that mess. And the truth of the matter is this. When we're in the middle of the mess, we are in the perfect position to receive help from Jesus. There's no better time than when you're in need or when you're hurting than to reach out for Jesus. Now I know, if you're like me, then some of you might be thinking that, now, we shouldn't really just be looking for Jesus in the middle of a mess. Well, that's true, and I tend to agree, but when I reflect on it, in reality, I'm a living, breathing mess. And on some occasions, I'm a little less messy, but still a mess nonetheless. So in reality, we ought never to take our focus off of Jesus. When we realize that we're always a mess, Jesus meets us in the mess. That means Jesus is always with us. So Jesus meets us in the mess, but the people who are most spiritually healthy are the ones who are willing to admit that they're always a mess. There's always a mess to be working through, whether it's self-inflicted or amongst friends or family. Jesus is always near because we're always in the middle of a mess. But the more we cling closely to him, the more we look for him, the more we trust in him, the more we call on his name, better it will be for us. We'll be closer to him. This brings me to my final point. Jesus is always in our boat. Let's pick it back up in John 6, verse 20. Listen to Jesus' reaction to seeing his disciples in terror. In verse 20 it says this, "But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. 'It is I, don't be afraid.'" How comforting are those words? Growing up, I used to hide in my house around different corners, waiting for my mom or my little sister to walk around the edge or walk around the corner. And then as soon as they would pass, I would go, "Boo!" and they would jump. And, to be honest, if smartphones were around during that time, I'd have some grade A footage to show you guys. But unfortunately, I don't have any. Now, when they realized that, my mom or my sister, when they realized that it was just me, their fear went away. Their anger might not have gone away. They might still be mad at me, but their fear went away. Why? Because they recognized that it was me, and they knew that in reality, I meant no harm. There was nothing that I was going to do to them. So when I think about the disciple situation, it's not exactly like the situation with me scaring my family, but the disciples were in a sketchy and extremely vulnerable situation. Wind and waves were stirring, and an unknown supernatural being was coming straight for them. There could be no greater relief than to hear the voice of their master when they were fearing the worst was coming. "It is I, do not be afraid." Don't we all want to hear Jesus' voice in that way? In the middle of a storm or a big mess that's going on, in the middle of a heartbreak, don't we want to hear Jesus' voice? "It is I, do not be afraid." The compassion of Jesus rings out loud and clear from the scripture. In verse 21, it says that they were willing to take him into the boat. And when I hear the word willing, I think of when Nadia sees me eating something that's like my favorite food or dessert or something like that, and she asks for a bite. As a good husband, or as me trying to be a good husband, I'm willing to share a bite of my favorite dessert, but I wouldn't say I was excited. And the word willing in this translation, or in the Greek, is actually the word thelo. And thelo is not like the willing, like me barely willing to give Nadia a bite. This thelo is actually more defined as to be resolved or determined, to desire, to delight, or to take pleasure in. The disciples were glad to take Jesus into the boat, and that's actually how other translations of the Bible read, is that they were glad to take him into the boat. They weren't just willing to bring Jesus into the boat, they were glad. There was a sense of security that came with Jesus coming into the boat. And to those of you who are doubting God right now, who are hardened by the brokenness of the world, or maybe you think that you've made too many mistakes. Maybe you think that you can never be forgiven for the things that you've done. If that was Jesus, then none of us would make it. But the reality is, because of what Jesus has accomplished, if you trust in him alone, he will always be in your boat. And to those of you who think your life is pretty good and you might not need Jesus, I want to ask you this question. Would you rather all the messes in your life just end and stop? Like, would you rather the wind calm down and the waves stop beating against your boat? Or would you rather have the one who created and sustains that storm, and you and everything else that you see, touch, taste, and hear in the boat with you? To me, it's not even close. Give me Jesus. And I want to ask you, choose Jesus. He will not only be with you as he promised until the very end of the age, but he will bring you to safety, even if it's not where you thought you would end up. Before we take communion, I want to read part of Psalm 107. It should sound familiar after reading John chapter 6 here. Starting in verse 23, it says, "Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind." Now, the psalm was written close to 1,000 years BC. This prophecy tells us of Jesus and his unfailing love for you and I, and his unfailing love for his disciples. This also tells us that God's word can be trusted. If you trust in Jesus and his word, and you cry out to him, your destiny is secure in his hands, and he will be able to always be with you. He will always be in your boat. Jesus laid down his life so that those who love him would have a destiny that's secure, an eternity with him forever. He meets our material needs day after day, but because of his death and his resurrection, he can always provide for our spiritual need.